candle flame shook as Elena Marsh stood before a man whose face she was forbidden to see. Her hands were cold inside her gloves, and her heart beat so loudly she feared the priest could hear it. The chapel was small and dim, lit only by a few candles that threw long shadows across the stone walls. No music played. No guests filled the pews. Only 4 silent witnesses stood at the back, their faces unreadable, their eyes fixed on the floor as if they too were afraid to look too closely at what was happening. The man beside her wore a long black coat and a dark veil that covered his face completely. She could see the outline of his jaw beneath the fabric, the shape of his shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly when the priest asked him to take her hand, but his face remained a mystery, hidden from her just as she had been promised it would be until the day he chose to show it. 3 weeks earlier, Elena had been sitting across from her father in his study, watching him grow smaller with every word he spoke. Their family had once been respected, their name spoken with admiration in every drawing room in the county. But bad investments, a failed harvest, and debts that multiplied like weeds had brought them to the edge of ruin. Her father's hands shook as he told her the only way to save their home, their name, and the roof over her younger brother's head was for her to accept a marriage proposal from a man neither of them had ever met in person. The offer had come through a lawyer, a quiet man named Henry Whitmore, who arrived at their door with papers instead of introductions. He explained that his client wished to remain anonymous until after the wedding. He would provide a generous settlement to clear the family's debts, ask for nothing in return except Elena's hand, and require only one condition. She must marry him without seeing his face, and she must not ask his name until he was ready to give it. Elena had laughed at first, certain it was some kind of trick or a cruel joke played by someone who wished to humiliate her family further. But her father's silence told her everything. He had already considered refusing, and found no other way forward. The debts were too large, the timeline too short, and the alternative was watching everything they had built disappear into the hands of strangers who cared nothing for their name. She agreed not because she wanted to, but because she loved her family more than she feared the unknown. Now, standing in this quiet chapel with a stranger's hand in hers, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The priest spoke the final words of the ceremony, and the man beside her lifted her hand to place a ring on her finger. His fingers were warm despite the cold of the room, and when they brushed against her skin, she felt something she did not expect. Not fear, not disgust, but a strange and quiet familiarity, as though she had felt this exact touch before, in a life she could not quite remember. When the ceremony ended, he did not kiss her. He simply bowed his head, his veiled face tilting toward her for just a moment, and then he turned and walked toward the chapel door without a single word. A carriage waited outside, its curtains drawn tight, and Elena was helped into it by an older woman who introduced herself only as Margaret, the housekeeper of her new home. The journey took nearly 2 hours, winding through forested roads that grew darker and more isolated with every mile. Elena watched the trees blur past the carriage window and tried to steady her breathing. She had left everything familiar behind. Her father's house, her small bedroom with its cracked window, the garden where she used to read in the afternoons. All of it was gone now, replaced by an uncertain future, with a man whose name she did not even know. When the carriage finally stopped, Elena stepped out into the courtyard of a manor unlike anything she had ever seen. The building rose 3 stories high, built from gray stone that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the evening sky. Ivy climbed one entire wall, and dozens of windows stared down at her like watchful eyes. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, grand but somehow lonely, as though the house itself had been waiting a long time for someone to bring it back to life. Margaret led her inside, through a wide entrance hall with a staircase that curved upward into darkness. The air smelled of old wood and beeswax candles. Portraits lined the walls, though Elena noticed something strange as she passed them. Several of the frames were empty, the canvases removed, leaving pale rectangles on the wallpaper where paintings had once hung. She wanted to ask why, but something about the quiet in the house told her questions were not welcome, at least not yet. Her room was on the 2nd floor, large and comfortable, with a fireplace already lit and a window that looked out over a garden gone slightly wild with neglect. Margaret told her that dinner would be brought to her that evening, and that her husband would visit her once the house had gone quiet for the night. She said this with a strange formality, as though she had said the same words to other brides before. though Elena could not imagine that was true. Elena ate alone that night, picking at a meal of roasted chicken and buttered vegetables while she stared at the empty chair across from her. She kept expecting the door to open, kept listening for footsteps in the hallway, but the house remained silent, except for the occasional creak of old wood settling into itself. It was well past midnight when she finally heard him. The door opened so quietly she almost missed it, and by the time she turned toward the sound, he was already standing just inside the room, the candlelight from the hallway casting his shadow long across the floor. He still wore the veil, though the black coat had been replaced with a simpler shirt, open at the collar. He said nothing for a long moment, simply standing there, watching her the way a man might watch something he was afraid to touch. "You do not have to be frightened of me," he finally said. His voice was low and careful, the kind of voice that had clearly practiced staying calm, even when the situation demanded otherwise. "I know this is not the marriage you imagined for yourself." "I did not imagine any marriage at all," Elena replied, surprising herself with how steady her own voice sounded. "Not until 3 weeks ago." He walked closer, though he stopped several feet away, keeping a careful distance between them. "I am sorry for that, truly. If there had been another way to protect my family, and yours, I would have taken it." "Protect us from what?" He hesitated, and in that pause, Elena felt the weight of everything he was choosing not to say. "From questions that would put both our families in danger. I promise you, Elena, none of this is done to hurt you. Every choice I have made has been to keep you safe, even before you knew my name." "You have not told me your name." "You may call me Julian," he said. "It is not the name I was born with, but it is the only one I can offer you tonight." Elena studied the shape of him in the dim light, the broad set of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself, like a man accustomed to hiding in plain sight. "How am I supposed to be a wife to a man I cannot see?" "You are not required to love me," Julian said softly. "Only to live beside me, and to trust that I will never give you reason to regret it. When the time is right, I will show you my face. I will tell you everything. But that day is not today, and I ask for your patience until it comes." He did not stay long that first night. He asked about her journey, about her family, about the books she liked to read, and though his questions were simple, there was something in the way he listened that made Elena feel, for the first time since the wedding, that she had not married a monster. Before he left, he paused at the door and turned back toward her. "Whatever you hear in this house," he said, "whatever whispers reach your ears about me, about my past, I ask only that you wait to judge me until I can explain it myself." Then he was gone, leaving Elena alone, with 100 new questions and not a single answer. Over the following days, Elena began to explore the manor, careful not to venture into rooms that seemed locked or forbidden. The servants were kind but guarded, answering her questions about the house with polite, practiced vagueness that told her they had been instructed to reveal nothing. Margaret was the closest thing she had to a friend in those early days, a woman with tired eyes and a gentle manner, who seemed to carry sadness for reasons Elena could not yet understand. One afternoon, while walking through the east corridor, Elena noticed a young maid, no older than 16, dusting a shelf near one of the empty picture frames. The girl introduced herself as Grace, and unlike the other servants, she seemed eager to talk, perhaps too young yet to have learned the same careful silence as everyone else in the house. "You must have questions about the master," Grace said quietly, glancing toward the hallway as if checking for anyone listening. "Everyone who comes here does. Do you know why he wears the veil?" Grace's face changed, a flicker of something like fear crossing her features before she composed herself again. "It is not my place to say, my lady, but I will tell you this. He was not always hidden. There was a time, before I came to work here, when his face was known to everyone in this county. Then why hide it now?" Grace shook her head and returned to her dusting, her earlier boldness fading as quickly as it had come. "Some things are safer left buried, my lady. I have already said more than I should." Elena did not press her further, though the words stayed with her for the rest of the day. Someone whose face had once been known, now hidden behind a veil in a house full of empty picture frames. It was a puzzle with too many missing pieces, and she found herself turning it over and over in her mind as she wandered the gardens that evening, watching the last light of day fade behind the tall trees that surrounded the estate. That night, Julian visited her again, and this time he brought a small wrapped package, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. It was a small gesture, but it struck Elena as strange, coming from a man supposedly guilty of some terrible secret. Monsters, she thought, did not remember that a woman liked to read before bed. "You seem thoughtful tonight," Julian observed, settling into the chair across from her bed, keeping the same careful distance he always kept. "I met one of your maids today, Grace." Something in his posture shifted, a subtle tension entering his shoulders. "And what did young Grace have to say?" "That your face was once known to everyone in this county. That something happened to change that." Julian was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched his gloved hands tighten slightly against the arms of the chair. "There will come a day, Elena, when I tell you everything. I promise you that day is closer than you think. But I need you to understand that what happened to me was not something I chose. It was something done to me, and revealing it too soon could put us both in danger." "Danger from whom?" "People who believed a lie about me, and who would prefer that lie remain buried, even if it means burying me along with it." Elena wanted to press further, to demand answers immediately, but something about the exhaustion in his voice, the weariness that seemed to weigh on him like a physical burden, made her hold her tongue. Instead, she asked him about the empty picture frames in the hallway, and he told her, quietly, that they once held portraits of his family, taken down the day his life changed forever, though he would not say why. Before he left that night, he paused at her door as he always did, and for a moment, Elena thought she saw him reach up toward the edge of his veil, as though considering removing it right there, right then. But he lowered his hand, gave a small, apologetic shake of his head, and disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. Elena lay awake long after he left, staring at the ceiling above her bed, listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window. She thought of the empty frames, the servants who flinched at questions, the man who touched her hand so gently, despite everything hidden behind his veil. Whoever Julian truly was, whatever secret waited behind that dark cloth, she found herself wanting, more than she expected, to discover the truth. Not because she feared him, but because some quiet part of her, one she could not yet explain, was beginning to trust him. A scream tore through the manor just before dawn, and Elena was on her feet before she even understood why. She ran barefoot into the hallway, her nightdress catching around her ankles, and found Grace standing frozen outside one of the locked rooms at the end of the east corridor, her hand pressed over her mouth. The door to the room stood open, though Elena had never seen it open before in all her weeks living in the house. Inside, she could see the edge of a bed, untouched by dust, despite the room clearly being unused, and a small writing desk covered in papers that someone had clearly been searching through in a hurry. "What happened?" Elena asked, gripping Grace's shoulder. "A rat, my lady," Grace stammered, though her eyes told a different story, one that had nothing to do with rats. "I am sorry to have woken you. Please, go back to your room." Elena did not move. Over Grace's shoulder, she caught sight of a portrait leaning against the wall inside the room, one of the missing paintings from the hallway. Its canvas turned away so she could not see the face. Before she could ask about it, Margaret appeared at the end of the hall, her expression stern in a way Elena had not seen before, and ushered both of them away with a firmness that left no room for questions. That morning, breakfast was served in silence. Julian did not join her, as he never did during daylight hours, but Elena found herself unable to eat, her mind circling back again and again to the hidden room, the turned portrait, the fear in Grace's eyes. She decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that she would find a way back into that room. Her chance came 3 days later, when Julian informed her, through Margaret, that he would be away from the house on business, and would not return until the following evening. It was the first time since her arrival that Elena would have the manor largely to herself, with only the servants going about their usual duties. She waited until the afternoon, when most of the staff had gathered in the kitchen for their own meal, and made her way quietly to the east corridor. The door to the locked room was closed again, but when she tried the handle, it gave way easily, unlocked, as though no one had expected anyone to try it during the day. Inside, dust motes floated in the thin light coming through a gap in the curtains. The desk was still covered in papers, and Elena moved toward it carefully, aware of every creak the floorboards made beneath her feet. Most of the papers were old letters, their ink faded, addressed to a name she did not recognize. Nathaniel Blackwood. She turned the pages over slowly, reading fragments of sentences that spoke of debts, of a trial, of a family disgraced by accusations that the letters insisted were false. Her hands trembled as she set the letters down and turned toward the portrait leaning against the wall. She hesitated only a moment before turning it around to face her. The painting showed a young man, perhaps 20 years old, standing proudly in a formal coat, his dark hair swept back from a face that was handsome in a serious, thoughtful way. Elena stared at the painting for a long time, searching for some resemblance to the shape of Julian's shoulders, the way he held himself, though the veil had always kept his face a mystery to her. There was something familiar about the eyes in the painting, something that tugged at a memory she could not quite reach. A floorboard creaked behind her, and Elena spun around to find Margaret standing in the doorway, her face pale. "You should not be in here, my lady," Margaret said, her voice quiet but firm. "Who is Nathaniel Blackwood?" Margaret's eyes flickered toward the portrait, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Finally, she stepped into the room and closed the door gently behind her. "That is a name that has not been spoken in this house for many years. I would ask you not to speak it again, especially not to the master." "Why not? Is it connected to him?" "It is connected to a tragedy," Margaret said carefully. "One that changed this family forever. More than that, I cannot say. It is not my story to tell, and I fear what might happen if the wrong ears heard it spoken carelessly." Elena wanted to press further, but something in Margaret's expression, a mixture of grief and fear that seemed to run bone deep, convinced her to let the matter rest, at least for now. She allowed Margaret to lead her from the room, and the door was locked once again behind them. The portrait returned to its hidden place against the wall. That evening, alone in her room, Elena found herself unable to stop thinking about the name Nathaniel Blackwood, about the portrait of the young man with familiar eyes, about the letters speaking of a trial and a disgrace. She began to wonder if Julian himself was connected to this hidden history, perhaps even a relative, someone whose fate had somehow shaped the strange conditions of her marriage. When Julian returned the following evening, he seemed different, more tired than usual, his shoulders carrying a weight that Elena had not noticed before. He visited her later that night, and this time, instead of settling into the chair across the room, he sat on the edge of her bed, closer than he had ever dared before. "You seem troubled," Elena said gently. "Business does not always go as planned," Julian replied, though something in his tone told her there was more he was not saying. "I hope my absence did not trouble you." Elena considered telling him about the room, about the portrait and the letters, but something held her back, a fear that speaking Nathaniel's name aloud might break some fragile trust that had been slowly building between them. Instead, she asked him something else entirely. "Do you ever wish things were different, that you did not have to hide?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that made her chest ache with an unexpected sympathy. "Every single day, there has not been a moment since this began that I have not longed to simply show you my face, and trust that you would still look at me the same way. But the world is not always kind to men who have been wrongly judged, Elena. Sometimes hiding is the only way to survive long enough to prove the truth." "What truth?" He reached out, hesitating only slightly before taking her hand in his, the same gentle warmth she had felt on their wedding day. "One day, I will tell you everything. I am closer to that day than you know, but I need a little more time, and I need you to trust me until then, even when the house whispers things that frighten you. The servants are afraid of something in this house. I have seen it in their eyes." "They are afraid for me," Julian said quietly. "Not of me. There is a difference, though I understand why it might not seem that way to you." Elena studied the shape of him in the candlelight, the careful way he held her hand, as though it were something precious he was afraid to break. Whatever secret waited behind his veil, whatever connected him to the hidden room and the name Nathaniel Blackwood, she found her fear slowly giving way to something else, a determination to understand him fully, not because she was told to, but because she wanted to. Over the following weeks, Elena settled deeper into the rhythm of life at the manor. She learned the names of every servant, memorized the layout of the gardens, and spent long afternoons in the library, reading books that Julian left for her, with small notes tucked inside the covers, observations about the story, or questions he thought she might enjoy considering. Slowly, carefully, a strange kind of intimacy began to grow between them, built entirely on words exchanged in darkness, on a trust neither of them could fully explain. But the whispers in the house did not stop. Elena began noticing that certain servants avoided the east corridor entirely, that Margaret's eyes grew distant whenever the subject of the master's past arose, that even Grace, once so willing to talk, had grown careful and quiet since the night of the locked room. One afternoon, while walking through the village nearby with Margaret as her companion, Elena overheard two merchants speaking in hushed tones near a market stall. She caught only fragments of their conversation, but one phrase struck her like a blow. "They say Nathaniel Blackwood died in disgrace, though no one ever saw the body." Elena stopped walking, her heart pounding in her chest. Margaret noticed her hesitation and gently steered her away from the stall, her grip firm on Elena's arm. "Do not listen to village gossip," Margaret said quietly, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "People love to speak of things they do not understand." But Elena could not shake the feeling that she had just heard something true, something that connected directly to the hidden portrait, the empty frames in the manor's hallway, and the man who visited her only in darkness, his face forever hidden behind a veil that seemed to grow heavier with meaning every single day. That night, when Julian came to her room, Elena studied him more closely than she ever had before, searching for some sign, some confirmation of the suspicion beginning to take root in her mind. He noticed her staring, and tilted his head slightly, the veil catching the candlelight. "You look at me differently tonight," he observed. "I heard something in the village today," Elena admitted. "A name. Nathaniel Blackwood." The silence that followed stretched so long that Elena began to wonder if he would ever speak again. When he finally did, his voice had changed, quieter, heavier, carrying a grief so old it seemed to have worn permanent grooves into his soul. "That name," he said slowly, "belonged to someone I loved very much, and lost in a way I have never fully recovered from. I ask you, Elena, please, not to speak it again until I am ready to explain everything. I promise you, that day is coming soon, sooner than either of us expected." Elena nodded, though the ache of unanswered questions sat heavy in her chest. Whatever connected Julian to that name, to the hidden room, to the grief that seemed to follow him like a shadow, she sensed that the truth was closer now than it had ever been, waiting just behind the veil he still refused to lift. Smoke filled the east corridor, before anyone realized the fire had started. Elena woke to the smell of burning wood, and the distant sound of shouting, and by the time she reached her door, the hallway outside was already thick with gray haze curling along the ceiling like a living thing. She pressed a hand over her mouth and ran toward the source of the commotion, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor, her heart hammering with a fear sharper than anything she had felt since arriving at the manor. Servants rushed past her carrying buckets of water, their faces streaked with soot, shouting instructions to one another in voices tight with panic. Grace appeared out of the smoke, coughing, her eyes wide with fear. "The east wing, my lady," she gasped. "A candle must have caught the curtains. It is spreading fast. Where is Julian?" Grace's face changed at the question, and before she could answer, a section of the ceiling further down the corridor groaned and gave way, sending a shower of sparks and burning debris crashing to the floor. Elena did not wait for an answer. She pushed past the fleeing servants and ran deeper into the smoke, toward the very room she had explored weeks before, the locked room with the hidden portrait and the desk full of secrets. She found Julian there, coughing violently, trying to pull the portrait and a bundle of papers free from the burning room before the flames could consume them entirely. A support beam above him had already begun to crack, weakened by the fire eating through the wood, and Elena screamed his name just as it gave way completely, crashing down toward him in a shower of burning splinters. He moved instinctively, throwing himself toward her instead of away from the danger, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her back through the doorway, just as the beam crashed down exactly where he had been standing moments before. They tumbled together into the corridor, and in the chaos of smoke and falling embers, something struck the edge of his veil, tearing it loose from his face entirely. For one long, suspended moment, Elena looked directly into the face of her husband, for the first time since their wedding day. And she knew him instantly. The face staring back at her, streaked with soot and lit by the orange glow of the fire, belonged to a man she had met years ago, long before the marriage, long before the veil and the secrecy and the empty picture frames. It was the face from a summer she remembered clearly, a face that had once smiled at her across a garden party when she was barely 17 years old, a face she had heard, years later, described in hushed and horrified tones as belonging to a man who had died in disgrace after being accused of a terrible crime. "Nathaniel," she whispered, the name escaping her lips before she could stop it. He froze, his eyes locking onto hers with an expression of pure devastation, as though the fire around them had suddenly become the least of his concerns. For a moment, neither of them moved, the chaos of the burning house fading into the background as the truth settled between them like a physical weight. Then more of the ceiling began to collapse, and instinct took over. He pulled her to her feet, and together they ran, coughing and stumbling through the smoke, until they burst out into the cool night air of the courtyard, where the rest of the household had already gathered to watch the east wing burn against the dark sky. Servants worked frantically with buckets and blankets to contain the flames, and slowly, painfully slowly, the fire began to lose its hunger, leaving behind a scorched and ruined section of the manor that would take months to repair. But Elena barely noticed any of it. She stood apart from the crowd, staring at the man beside her, finally seeing his face clearly in the flickering light of the dying fire. He looked older than the boy she remembered from that summer garden party, lines of worry and grief etched into features that had once been soft and untroubled. But it was unmistakably him, Nathaniel Blackwood, a name she had heard spoken with pity and horror for years, a name attached to a story of scandal and disgrace that had gripped the entire county when she was still a girl too young to fully understand what had happened. "You are supposed to be dead," she said quietly, her voice trembling with something between shock and anger. "Everyone believed you died." Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly, as though bracing himself for a conversation he had dreaded for a very long time. "I let them believe it," he said. "It was the only way to survive what happened. You lied to me. From the very beginning, you lied to me. I never lied about who I am inside," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Only about the name the world once knew me by. Elena, please, let me explain everything. You deserve the whole truth now, and I promise to give it to you." Elena wanted to walk away, to put distance between herself and a man who had hidden something so enormous from her for months, who had let her fall into whatever tangled feelings had grown between them, without ever telling her the most basic fact about who he truly was. But something in his eyes, some old and familiar sorrow, held her in place. "Then explain," she said. "Tonight, I will not wait any longer." They moved away from the chaos of the fire, into the quiet of the garden, where the smell of smoke still lingered, but the noise of shouting servants faded into a distant hum. Nathaniel sat heavily on a stone bench, running his hands through his hair, and for a long moment he simply stared at the ground, gathering the courage to speak. "You remember the garden party, years ago," he began. "My family was respected then. My father held a position of influence in the county, and I had every reason to believe my future was secure. I was engaged to be married, though not to you, to a woman my family had chosen for reasons of business and alliance. Her name was Charlotte, and though our match was arranged, I believed we would build a decent life together." Elena listened, saying nothing, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the cold night air. Then one autumn, Charlotte's father died suddenly, and evidence surfaced suggesting his death was not natural. "Poison," they said. And because I stood to gain financially from the marriage, because certain letters were found that had been forged to look as though I had motive and knowledge of the poison used, I became the primary suspect in his murder. "But you did not do it," Elena said, though it came out more as a question than a statement. "I did not," Nathaniel said firmly. "I swear to you on everything I hold dear, I did not. But the evidence was convincing enough that I faced trial, and though the court could not fully prove my guilt, the accusation alone destroyed everything. My family's name was ruined. Charlotte's family withdrew from the engagement and spread rumors that painted me as a monster. My own father, ashamed and broken, could barely look at me in the months that followed." "Who forged the letters?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "A man named Edmund Foxwell, a business partner of Charlotte's father, who stood to inherit control of several profitable ventures," if the marriage never took place, and if I was removed from consideration entirely. I could not prove it then. I barely survived the trial with my life, and the moment I was released, threats began arriving, warning me that if I remained in the county, if I continued trying to clear my name, I would not survive the year. So you disappeared. I staged my own death, Nathaniel said quietly. With the help of a few loyal friends, including the man who now serves as my lawyer, Henry Whitmore, I took a new identity. I built a new life, under the name Julian, far enough from my old one that Edmund Foxwell would believe the threat eliminated and stop searching for me. For years, I lived quietly, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth and reclaim my name. And me? Elena asked, her voice sharper now. Where do I fit into all of this? Nathaniel looked up at her, and something in his expression softened, the careful composure of the storyteller giving way to something rawer, more honest. You fit into this because I remembered you, Elena. From that single afternoon at the garden party, years ago, before any of this happened. You were kind to me, when so few others were, even then. When my lawyer told me your family needed help, when he suggested the arrangement that would save your father from ruin, I agreed immediately, not only because it gave me a way to remain hidden and protected, but because some part of me hoped, foolishly perhaps, that I might have a chance to know you properly, without the shadow of my past hanging over everything. Elena stared at him, trying to reconcile the frightened, grieving man in front of her, with the mysterious veiled figure who had visited her room each night, gentle and careful, always keeping his distance, always protecting some fragile hope that she could not have understood until this very moment. You should have told me from the beginning. I know, Nathaniel said, his voice thick with regret. I told myself I would, once I felt certain you were safe, once I had gathered enough evidence to finally clear my name and remove the danger that still follows me. I was wrong to wait this long. I see that now, especially after tonight. Elena sat down on the bench beside him, the anger inside her slowly giving way to something more complicated, a tangled mixture of hurt and understanding that she could not easily separate. What evidence have you gathered? Letters, he said. Testimony from a former clerk who worked for Edmund Foxwell and witnessed the forgery firsthand. It has taken years to convince him to come forward, given the danger it puts him in as well. We were close, very close, to finally presenting everything to a magistrate willing to reopen the case. But now that my face has been seen, now that word may spread that Nathaniel Blackwood is alive, Edmund will know I am coming for him, and he will not sit quietly and wait to be exposed. Then what happens now? Nathaniel looked toward the smoldering remains of the east wing, the smoke still curling faintly against the night sky. Now, I have no choice but to move faster than I planned, and I understand, completely. If you wish to distance yourself from whatever danger follows me, I will not force you to stay bound to a man who has brought nothing but complication and risk into your life. Elena thought of her father, saved from ruin because of this man's generosity. She thought of the gentle way he had visited her each night, never demanding anything, only offering kindness and patience while he carried this enormous secret alone. She thought of the fear in the servants' eyes, the empty picture frames, the years he had spent grieving a life that had been stolen from him through no fault of his own. I did not marry a stranger tonight, she said quietly. I have known your face for years, even if I did not know it was hidden behind that veil. I am not leaving, Nathaniel, but I want the truth, all of it, from this moment forward. No more secrets. Relief flooded across his face, so profound that his shoulders seemed to drop an inch, releasing tension he had likely carried for years. No more secrets, he agreed. I promise you that. Behind them, the last of the fire finally died out, leaving the east wing a blackened ruin against the night sky. But for the first time since her wedding day, Elena felt as though something honest had finally been built between them, forged not in the darkness of hidden rooms and veiled faces, but in the harsh, revealing light of truth finally spoken aloud. The danger, however, was only beginning. A rider arrived at the manor gates before sunrise, his horse lathered with sweat, carrying a message that turned Nathaniel's face pale the moment he read it. Elena watched from the top of the stairs as he crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw tightening with a fury she had never seen from him before. Henry Whitmore, his lawyer, stood beside him, reading over his shoulder, his own expression grim. What is it? Elena asked, hurrying down to join them. Nathaniel handed her the letter without a word. It was brief, written in a hand she did not recognize, but the message was unmistakable. Edmund Foxwell had learned that Nathaniel Blackwood was alive, and he was offering a warning disguised as a courtesy. Abandon any attempt to reopen the old case, leave the county forever, or face consequences that would extend beyond Nathaniel himself, to everyone connected to him, including his new wife. He knows about me, Elena said quietly, her hands trembling as she lowered the letter. He knows enough, Henry said grimly. Word of the fire likely reached the village by now, along with descriptions of the man who was seen without his veil. Foxwell has spent years paying informants throughout this county. It was only a matter of time before news like this reached him. We need to move the timeline forward, Nathaniel said, pacing the length of the entrance hall. The clerk, the one who witnessed the forgery. Where is he now? Still in hiding, 2 counties south, Henry replied. I can send word, but bringing him forward on short notice carries enormous risk. If Foxwell learns we plan to use his testimony, he may take steps to silence him permanently before we ever reach the magistrate. Elena listened to the exchange with growing dread, understanding for the first time just how dangerous the truth Nathaniel carried truly was. This was not simply a matter of clearing a name tarnished by old gossip. Edmund Foxwell had already shown, years ago, that he was willing to have a man framed for murder to protect his own interests. There was no reason to believe he would hesitate now to protect himself through even darker means. What can I do? Elena asked. Both men turned to look at her, surprise evident on their faces. This is not your burden to carry, Nathaniel said gently. I never intended for you to be pulled this deeply into danger. I am your wife, Elena replied firmly. Whatever danger follows you, now follows me as well, whether either of us wishes it or not. I would rather stand beside you and help than hide in this house, waiting to learn whether you have survived whatever comes next. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering behind the exhaustion in his eyes. Henry cleared his throat and suggested they move the discussion to the study, away from servants who might overhear more than was safe for them to know. Over the following hours, they worked together to form a plan. Henry would travel personally to retrieve the clerk, using a route that avoided the main roads where Foxwell's informants were most likely to be watching. Nathaniel would remain at the manor, reluctant to expose himself further until the moment came to present the evidence formally before a magistrate. Elena, meanwhile, offered something neither man had considered. My father still has connections among the county's older families, she said. People who remember what happened to your family, Nathaniel, who never fully believed the accusations against you. If we can quietly gather statements from those who doubted your guilt even at the time of the trial, it will strengthen the case considerably, and it gives Foxwell fewer places to hide should this reach the courts. Nathaniel's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something warmer. You would do that? Involve your own family further in this? My family already owes you a debt, Elena said simply. This is not a burden. It is a chance to repay it, and to help set right something that should never have happened to you in the first place. Over the following days, Elena traveled quietly with Margaret as her companion, visiting families her father had known for decades, carefully raising the subject of the old Blackwood trial in conversations that seemed, on the surface, like nothing more than idle curiosity. She found, to her quiet relief, that many of the older families remembered the case with unease, several admitting privately that they had always found the evidence against Nathaniel suspicious, the timing of the forged letters too convenient, the involvement of Edmund Foxwell too favorable to his own business interests to be entirely innocent. Slowly, a collection of written statements began to grow, tucked carefully into a locked case that Henry had left behind before departing to retrieve the clerk. Elena felt a growing sense of purpose in the work, a feeling entirely different from the passive uncertainty that had defined the early weeks of her marriage. For the first time, she was not simply waiting to learn her husband's secrets. She was actively helping to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. But danger followed close behind every step of progress. One evening, returning from a visit to a family on the far side of the village, Elena and Margaret's carriage was stopped along a quiet stretch of road by 2 men on horseback, their faces partially covered, their intentions clear from the moment they blocked the path forward. Margaret gasped and gripped Elena's hand tightly as the men approached the carriage window. Tell your husband, one of them said, his voice low and threatening, "that Edmund Foxwell does not make idle warnings. The next visit will not be so polite." Before Elena could respond, the men turned their horses and disappeared into the trees, leaving the carriage driver shaken and the two women trembling in the aftermath. They returned to the manor immediately, and when Elena recounted what had happened, Nathaniel's face turned white with fury and fear in equal measure. "This ends now," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I will not allow him to threaten you the way he threatened me all those years ago." "We cannot move recklessly," Elena said, though her own hands still trembled from the encounter. "If we act too quickly, without enough evidence, Foxwell will simply deny everything and use his influence to protect himself further. We need Henry to return with the clerk. We need every statement we have gathered to be presented properly, all at once, so there is no room for him to escape the truth." Nathaniel paced the length of the study, his jaw clenched tight. "And if he decides not to wait for us to finish gathering evidence, if he decides to act first, then we prepare for that possibility too," Elena said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "We do not hide from this, Nathaniel, not anymore. We face it together, the way we should have from the very beginning." He stopped pacing and looked at her, something shifting behind his eyes, a recognition perhaps that the woman he had married under such strange and secretive circumstances had become, without either of them fully realizing it, a true partner in every sense of the word. He crossed the room and took her hands in his, the same gentle warmth she remembered from their wedding day, though now there was nothing hidden between them. "I am sorry I ever believed I had to carry this alone," he said quietly. "You do not have to carry it alone anymore," Elena replied. "Not while I am standing beside you." Outside the study window, storm clouds gathered over the distant hills, dark and heavy, with the promise of rain, mirroring the tension building steadily toward whatever confrontation still waited ahead. Somewhere beyond those hills, Edmund Foxwell was surely making his own plans, aware now that the man he believed dead had returned, aware that the truth he had buried for years was finally clawing its way back toward the surface. Neither Elena nor Nathaniel knew exactly what form his next move would take, but both understood, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that the quiet, hidden life they had built together was ending, and whatever came next would determine not only Nathaniel's future, but their survival itself. Henry Whitmore arrived back at the manor in the middle of the night, his horse nearly collapsing from exhaustion, and the moment Elena saw his face in the torchlight, she knew something had gone terribly wrong. "Where is the clerk?" Nathaniel asked, already moving toward him across the courtyard. "Safe, for now," Henry said, breathing heavily, as a stable hand rushed to take his horse. "But we were followed for nearly a full day before I managed to lose them in the hills near Ashford. Foxwell knows we are gathering testimony against him. He knows the clerk is willing to speak." Elena felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "Where is the clerk now?" "Hidden in a farmhouse 2 miles from here, under the protection of a family loyal to my late father," Henry said. "But we cannot leave him there long. If Foxwell's men found our trail even once, they may find it again." Nathaniel's face hardened with the particular calm of a man who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of danger. "Then we bring him here tonight, under cover of darkness, and we move forward with everything we have. Waiting any longer only gives Foxwell more time to prepare his own defense, or worse." Henry nodded, though exhaustion weighed heavily on his features. "There is something else you should know. While traveling, I learned that Foxwell has been meeting privately with a magistrate in the Eastern District, a man known to owe him certain favors. If Foxwell believes he can secure a sympathetic ear before we ever present our case, he may attempt to have any future proceedings moved to a court where the outcome is already decided in his favor." "Then we cannot go to that magistrate," Elena said immediately. "We need someone with no connection to Foxwell whatsoever, someone whose judgment cannot be questioned by anyone." "There is a magistrate in the capital," Henry said slowly, considering the idea. "Judge Aldrich Rowe, respected, incorruptible by reputation, and entirely outside Foxwell's usual circle of influence. But convincing him to hear a case from so far outside his jurisdiction, on short notice, with everything we currently have, will not be simple." "Then we make it simple," Nathaniel said. "We travel to the capital ourselves, present the evidence directly, and force Foxwell to answer for what he did, in a court where his money and influence carry no weight." The plan was set into motion before dawn. A small group, Nathaniel, Elena, Henry, the frightened but resolute clerk whose name was Oliver Bramwell, and 2 trusted servants for protection, departed the manor under the cover of a foggy morning, taking a route deliberately chosen to avoid the main roads where Foxwell's informants were most likely watching. The journey to the capital would take nearly 3 days, and every mile felt heavy with the knowledge that danger could appear from any direction at any moment. On the second night of travel, staying at a quiet inn far from the county where anyone might recognize them, Elena found herself unable to sleep, her mind circling endlessly around the risks ahead. She left her room and found Nathaniel sitting alone near the inn's small fireplace, staring into the flames with an expression she had come to recognize as the particular weight of old grief resurfacing. "You are thinking of your father," she said softly, settling into the chair beside him. He nodded slowly. "He died 3 years after the trial, still believing, I think, that some part of the accusations must have been true, even though he never said it aloud. I never had the chance to prove my innocence to him before he passed. That is a wound that this trial, whatever its outcome, will never fully heal." Elena reached over and took his hand, the same gesture he had offered her so many nights in the darkness of her bedroom, back when his face was still hidden and his true name still a mystery. "You will prove it to everyone who matters now, to Charlotte's family, to the county, to your own conscience. Your father's belief, or lack of it, does not change the truth of who you are." Nathaniel turned to look at her, firelight flickering across features that no longer needed to hide behind any veil. "I do not think I have properly thanked you, Elena, for everything you have risked to stand beside me through this. You could have refused the marriage entirely. You could have distanced yourself the moment you learned the truth. Instead, you have fought for me as fiercely as I once fought, alone, for myself. You saved my family from ruin before you ever asked anything of me," Elena said. "I do not forget kindness that easily. And somewhere between the veiled visits and the quiet conversations in the dark, I stopped seeing you as a stranger, Nathaniel. I started seeing you as someone I genuinely cared for, long before I ever saw your face." He lifted her hand gently and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, a small gesture, but one that carried the full weight of everything unspoken between them. Outside, the wind picked up against the inn's shuttered windows, carrying with it the distant sound of a storm building somewhere over the hills, echoing the tension that still lay ahead on their journey. They reached the capital on the evening of the 3rd day, weary from travel but resolute in their purpose. Henry arranged a private meeting with Judge Aldrich Rowe, presenting their case carefully, laying out the forged letters, Oliver Bramwell's first-hand testimony of witnessing Edmund Foxwell orchestrate the forgery, and the collection of statements Elena had gathered from families throughout the county who had long doubted Nathaniel's guilt. Judge Rowe listened with a stern, careful attention, asking pointed questions of Oliver Bramwell that tested the consistency of his account, examining the forged letters against samples of Edmund Foxwell's known handwriting that Henry had managed to obtain through careful, quiet inquiry over the preceding weeks. By the time the meeting concluded, well past midnight, the judge's expression had shifted from cautious skepticism to something closer to grim resolve. "This is a compelling case," Judge Rowe said finally. "Compelling enough that I am willing to reopen the matter formally, though I must warn you, Mr. Blackwood, that Edmund Foxwell will not simply allow this proceeding to happen without resistance. A man of his influence has many ways of delaying, obstructing, or discrediting testimony he finds inconvenient." "I am prepared for that," Nathaniel said firmly. "I have spent years preparing for exactly this moment." "Then let us proceed," the judge said, "and let the truth, finally, be given the chance to speak for itself." A formal hearing was scheduled for 4 days later, enough time for word to reach Edmund Foxwell that the case against him was being reopened in a court entirely outside his influence. Word also reached him, through channels neither Elena nor Nathaniel could have anticipated, that his men had lost track of the traveling party somewhere on the road south, and that Oliver Bramwell, the clerk he had spent years ensuring remained silent, was now prepared to testify openly before a respected magistrate. The days leading up to the hearing were tense beyond anything Elena had experienced since the fire at the manor. Foxwell, it seemed, was not a man who accepted defeat quietly. Threats arrived at the small townhouse Henry had secured for them, delivered by anonymous messengers who vanished into the crowded capital streets before anyone could catch more than a glimpse of them. One evening, a brick was thrown through a window, wrapped with a note warning that testimony against a man as powerful as Edmund Foxwell rarely ended well for those brave enough to offer it. Elena found herself standing guard some nights, alongside the household's small security detail, unable to sleep with the weight of everything hanging over them. Nathaniel grew increasingly protective, insisting she remain close to the house rather than venturing into the city streets, a request Elena reluctantly honored, understanding the genuine fear behind his concern, even as it chafed against the independence she had discovered in herself over these past difficult weeks. 2 nights before the hearing, disaster nearly struck when a fire, deliberately set, was discovered smoldering in the townhouse's small stable, an unmistakable echo of the blaze that had first revealed Nathaniel's true identity months earlier. The household staff extinguished it quickly, before serious damage occurred, but the message behind the attempt was unmistakable. Foxwell was growing desperate, and desperate men, Nathaniel warned grimly, were often the most dangerous. "He is trying to frighten us into abandoning the hearing," Henry said, examining the scorched remains of the stable the following morning. "If he believed he could simply eliminate us quietly, he would have already tried something far more direct. This is intimidation, not yet violence." "Yet," Elena repeated quietly, the words settling heavily in her chest. Despite the mounting danger, none of them wavered in their determination. Oliver Bramwell, though visibly frightened, remained steadfast in his commitment to testify, driven by a guilt he had carried for years over his silent complicity in Nathaniel's ruined reputation. The statements gathered from the county families remained secure in Henry's locked case, carefully guarded day and night, and Elena, despite the fear that gripped her more tightly with each passing hour, found her resolve only strengthening as the hearing drew closer. On the morning of the hearing, Elena dressed carefully, choosing a simple but formal gown, and found Nathaniel waiting for her in the townhouse's small entrance hall, dressed in a dark coat that made him look, for the first time since she had known him, entirely unguarded, entirely himself, with no veil, no hidden name, nothing left to conceal. "Whatever happens today," he said quietly, taking her hands in his, "I want you to know that these past months, despite everything, despite the secrets, and the danger, and the fear, have given me something I thought I had lost forever, the day my father stopped looking at me the same way. They have given me hope, Elena, and that hope exists because of you." Elena squeezed his hands, steadying her own trembling nerves as much as his. "Then let us go finish what you started all those years ago. Let us make sure the truth is finally heard." Together, they stepped out into the busy capital streets, walking toward the courthouse where Edmund Foxwell would soon be forced to answer, at long last, for the lies that had stolen years of Nathaniel's life and nearly cost them everything they had only just begun to build together. The courthouse was already crowded by the time Elena and Nathaniel arrived, word of the reopened case having spread quickly through the capital's tight circles of gossip and speculation. Edmund Foxwell sat near the front of the chamber, flanked by 2 lawyers dressed in fine coats that spoke of considerable wealth, his expression carefully composed into something that resembled calm confidence, though Elena noticed the way his fingers drummed restlessly against the arm of his chair, betraying a tension he could not fully hide. He was an older man than Elena had imagined, silver-haired and sharp-featured, with eyes that swept the room like a predator assessing threats. When his gaze landed on Nathaniel, something flickered across his face, brief but unmistakable: fear. Judge Aldrich Rowe entered the chamber and called the proceedings to order, and the room settled into a tense, expectant silence. Foxwell's lawyer rose first, attempting to argue that the case had already been settled years prior, that reopening it now, based on the testimony of a single frightened clerk and a collection of second-hand statements from villagers with no direct knowledge of the events in question, was a waste of the court's time and an insult to a respected member of the business community. Judge Rowe listened patiently before responding with a firmness that left no room for argument. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented and finds sufficient grounds to proceed. Mr. Bramwell will be called to testify, and the physical evidence, including the handwriting samples in question, will be examined thoroughly. If Mr. Foxwell has nothing to hide, he has nothing to fear from this proceeding." Oliver Bramwell was called first, and Elena watched as the young clerk, still visibly nervous, walked to the front of the chamber and took his place before the judge. His voice trembled at first, but as he began to speak, describing in careful detail the night years ago when Edmund Foxwell had summoned him to a private study and instructed him to copy Nathaniel's handwriting onto a series of letters designed to implicate him in the poisoning of Charlotte's father, his voice steadied, strengthened by the weight of a truth he had carried silently for far too long. "I was young," Oliver said, his eyes occasionally flickering toward Foxwell, who sat rigid with barely contained fury. "I needed the position, and I was afraid to refuse him. He told me it was simply a matter of business, that no real harm would come of it. I did not fully understand, until the trial began, exactly what those letters would be used to accuse an innocent man of." Foxwell's lawyer attempted to discredit the testimony, suggesting that Oliver had been paid or coerced into fabricating this account to protect himself from some unrelated wrongdoing. But Judge Rowe pressed further, asking pointed questions about specific details of the forgery that only someone with genuine first-hand knowledge could have answered, and Oliver's responses remained consistent, detailed, and utterly convincing. Next came the physical evidence, handwriting experts called by Henry Whitmore, comparing the forged letters against genuine samples of both Nathaniel's actual handwriting and samples secretly obtained from Foxwell's own business correspondence over the years. The differences, once pointed out clearly to the court, were unmistakable, subtle inconsistencies in letter formation that had been overlooked entirely during the original Rush trial, inconsistencies that any careful examination would have caught, had the original proceedings not been conducted with such haste and prejudice against Nathaniel from the very beginning. Then came the statements from the county families, read aloud one by one, each expressing long-held doubts about the case, suspicions about the convenient timing of the accusations, observations about how quickly and thoroughly Edmund Foxwell had benefited from Nathaniel's downfall, inheriting control of business ventures that had previously belonged jointly to Charlotte's father, and, through the arranged marriage, would eventually have passed partially into Nathaniel's own hands. By the time Nathaniel himself was called to testify, the mood in the courtroom had shifted noticeably, skepticism giving way to something closer to sympathy, as the full weight of the years of injustice became increasingly clear. Nathaniel spoke calmly, recounting the trial, the threats that followed his release, the necessity of staging his own death to survive, his voice carrying a quiet dignity that seemed to move even some of the courtroom's most hardened observers. "I did not choose to disappear because I feared justice," Nathaniel said, his eyes locked steadily on Judge Rowe. "I disappeared because I had already witnessed how thoroughly justice could be corrupted by a man with enough money and influence to bend the truth to his own advantage. I am standing here today not out of anger, but because I believe, finally, that this court is prepared to hear the truth without prejudice, and I am prepared to trust that belief with everything I have left." When Edmund Foxwell was finally called to answer the accusations directly, his composure began to crack under the weight of Judge Rowe's careful, relentless questioning. He grew evasive when pressed about the timing of certain business transactions that had benefited him enormously in the immediate aftermath of Nathaniel's trial. He stumbled over explanations for correspondence found among his private papers, subpoenaed by Henry weeks earlier, that hinted at his awareness of the forgery scheme long before it was ever carried out. The final blow came when Henry produced a witness Elena had not even known existed until that very moment, a former household servant of Foxwell's, tracked down through weeks of careful, quiet investigation, who testified that she had personally overheard her former employer discussing plans to eliminate any rival claim to Charlotte's father's business holdings, plans that had been set into motion mere weeks before the poisoning that started this entire tragedy. By the time the hearing concluded late that afternoon, the courtroom had grown utterly silent, the weight of the accumulated evidence leaving little room for doubt. Judge Rowe took a brief recess to consider his ruling, and Elena sat gripping Nathaniel's hand tightly, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and lingering fear that even now, somehow, the truth might not be enough. When the judge returned, his expression was grave and resolute. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented before this court," Judge Rowe announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, "I find that Nathaniel Blackwood was wrongfully accused and convicted through the deliberate fabrication of evidence orchestrated by Edmund Foxwell, motivated by financial gain achieved through the ruin of an innocent man's reputation and life. This court formally clears the name of Nathaniel Blackwood of all charges related to the death of his former fiancée's father, and orders a full investigation into Edmund Foxwell's conduct, including the poisoning itself, which this evidence now strongly suggests he orchestrated personally to secure control of business interests that were never rightfully his. The chamber erupted into murmurs of astonishment, and Elena felt tears spring to her eyes as the weight of years, of hidden rooms and empty picture frames, and a face concealed behind a mourning veil, finally began to lift from the man beside her. Foxwell was led from the courtroom under guard, his earlier composure entirely shattered, his protests growing increasingly desperate as guards escorted him toward a holding cell to await further charges related to the original poisoning itself. Nathaniel remained frozen in his seat for a long moment after the ruling was announced, as though he could not quite believe the words he had just heard. Elena wrapped her arms around him, and finally, after everything, she felt him release a breath that seemed to carry with it years of accumulated grief and fear. "It is over," he whispered against her hair. "After everything, it is finally over." "Not over," Elena corrected gently, pulling back to look at him. "Beginning. This is where your real life begins again, Nathaniel, this time without any veil standing between you and the world." Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by word of the dramatic proceedings, and among them, Elena spotted her own father, who had traveled to the capital the moment he received word of the hearing, his face bright with pride and relief as he embraced his daughter for the first time since her wedding day. Behind him stood Margaret and Grace, who had insisted on making the journey themselves, unable to remain at the manor while the fate of the household they loved was decided so far away. "You did it!" her father said, holding her at arm's length to look at her properly. "Both of you did it!" Nathaniel extended his hand toward Elena's father, a gesture of respect and gratitude that needed no additional words to explain its meaning. Her father, after a brief hesitation, pulled him instead into a firm embrace, welcoming him properly, for the first time, as family, rather than simply as the mysterious benefactor who had once saved them from ruin. As the small group made their way back toward the townhouse that evening, celebrating quietly amid the exhaustion of everything they had endured, Elena found a quiet moment alone with Nathaniel on the townhouse balcony, watching the lights of the capital flicker to life beneath a darkening sky. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now," Nathaniel said, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders, "we return home. We rebuild the East Wing, properly this time, without secrets hidden behind its walls. We hang the family portraits back where they belong, including, I hope, one of us together, painted honestly, with nothing concealed." Elena leaned into him, feeling, for the first time since that strange and frightening wedding day months earlier, a genuine and settled peace. "I think I would like that very much." Below them, the capital continued its restless evening rhythm, unaware entirely of the quiet, hard-won victory that had just reshaped two lives forever. But for Elena and Nathaniel, standing together beneath the darkening sky, nothing else in the wide world mattered quite as much as the simple, extraordinary fact that they finally stood before each other, with nothing left to hide. Rain hammered against the windows of the manor on the night Edmund Foxwell's trial for the original poisoning finally concluded, and Elena sat beside Nathaniel in their newly rebuilt study, waiting for word to arrive from the capital. The month since the hearing had brought enormous change to the estate. The scorched remains of the East Wing had been cleared away entirely, replaced by fresh timber and stone that still smelled faintly of sawdust and new paint. The empty picture frames that had once lined the hallway, haunting reminders of a life Nathaniel had been forced to abandon, now held new portraits, including a formal painting of Elena and Nathaniel together, commissioned shortly after their return from the capital, their faces open and unguarded, nothing hidden beneath veils or secrecy. A messenger arrived just before midnight, soaked through from the storm, carrying a letter from Henry Whitmore. Nathaniel's hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal and read the contents, and Elena watched his expression shift from tense anticipation to something that looked, finally, like complete and total relief. "Foxwell has been convicted," he said quietly, lowering the letter, "of the poisoning, and of conspiracy to destroy my reputation through forgery. He will spend the remainder of his life imprisoned. Charlotte's family holdings, the ones he seized through his crimes, are being returned to their rightful heirs, with a portion restored to compensate for the years of suffering his lies caused. Elena took his hand, feeling the tension finally drain from his fingers. "Then it is truly finished." "Truly finished," Nathaniel agreed, though his voice carried a complicated mixture of relief and lingering grief for all the years that could never be recovered, for a father who had died without ever learning the truth, for a decade spent in hiding, cut off from the life he should have been living openly. In the weeks that followed, life at the manor settled into a rhythm neither of them could have imagined during those early, strange months of veiled visits and midnight conversations, conducted across careful distances. Nathaniel resumed his true name publicly, and though some in the county remained hesitant at first, memories of old scandals slow to fade entirely. The overwhelming evidence presented at trial gradually restored the respect his family had once commanded. Old friends who had distanced themselves during the scandal began cautiously reaching out again, some with genuine apology for having believed the worst of him so many years ago. Margaret, who had served the household with quiet loyalty throughout the darkest years of Nathaniel's hiding, was formally promoted to oversee the entire estate, a position she accepted with tears of genuine gratitude. Grace, no longer required to guard careful secrets from a curious young mistress, blossomed into a warmer, more open presence in the household, eventually training under Margaret's guidance to take on greater responsibilities of her own. Elena's father visited often, his once troubled finances now fully restored, his relationship with his daughter deepened by everything they had endured together. He and Nathaniel developed a genuine friendship over long evenings discussing business and history, the awkwardness of their first strange arrangement, long since replaced by real affection and mutual respect. One afternoon, nearly a year after the trial concluded, Elena found Nathaniel standing in the newly restored East Wing, staring at the freshly hung family portraits, his father's painting now displayed prominently alongside his own, finally reunited after years of forced separation. "I used to imagine this moment," he admitted softly, as she joined him. "Standing here, in this house, with my name cleared and my face uncovered, imagining what it might feel like. I never quite believed it would actually happen." "And how does it feel now that it has?" Elena asked. Nathaniel turned to look at her, the warmth in his expression carrying none of the guarded caution that had once defined every interaction between them. "It feels like the beginning of everything I thought I had lost forever. A home, a family. A wife who chose to stand beside me not because a veil concealed some frightening unknown, but because she came to know exactly who I was, flaws and history and all, and chose to love me regardless." "I did not just choose to love you despite everything," Elena said, stepping closer and taking his hands in hers. "I came to love you because of the man those difficult years revealed you to be. Patient, even when patience cost you everything. Honest, even when honesty put you at enormous risk. Brave enough to finally stand and fight for the truth, even after years of hiding, convinced you it might never be possible." Nathaniel pulled her into an embrace, and for a long, quiet moment, they simply stood together, beneath the restored portraits of a family finally whole again. The storm of secrets and danger that had defined their beginning now settled into the peaceful, hard-won calm of a life built honestly, together, with nothing left concealed between them. Outside, the estate grounds had been restored as well. Gardens once left wild with neglect now carefully tended, flowering in colors that Elena had never seen bloom during those uncertain early months of her marriage. The manor itself, once a place of shadows and whispered fears among the servants, had transformed slowly into a genuinely warm and welcoming home, filled with laughter that echoed through hallways that had once known only careful, guarded silence. Years later, when their own children asked about the strange story of how their parents had first married, Elena would tell them, with a smile that still carried traces of the fear and wonder of those early days, about a veiled wedding in a dim chapel, about a mysterious husband who visited only in darkness, about empty picture frames and hidden rooms, and a devastating fire that finally revealed a face she recognized from a memory years old. She would tell them how she had married a stranger behind a veil, uncertain and afraid, trusting only her family's desperate need and a stranger's quiet kindness. And she would tell them how, when the veil finally fell away and she saw his true face at last, she discovered she already knew his name, not because fate had simply handed her the answer, but because somewhere beneath all that careful hiding, She had already come to know the true heart of the man wearing it. And that, she would tell them, settling into the comfortable warmth of a home built on hard-won honesty, was the truest kind of love story there could ever be. Not one built on immediate certainty or easy beginnings, but one that survived fire and danger and years of hidden truth, emerging on the other side stronger, deeper, and more real than either of them could have imagined, on that strange and frightening wedding night when a veil first stood between them.